After World War II, the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union and their allies on both sides helped fuel inspiration behind a new genre of fiction featuring globe-trotting super spies, fabulous technological gadgets, impressive martial arts action, duplicitous double agents, and over-the-top megalomaniac villains. It wasn't too long before the brand new genre of role-playing games decided to get in on the action with the publication of the world's first espionage role-playing game, Top Secret. We're going to talk about that game today on Daddy Rolled a One. Hello there, and welcome back. I'm Martin, and this is another video in my series on the history of early tabletop role-playing games, including Dungeons & Dragons, and one of the company that published them, Tactical Studies Rules, and one of its later descendant companies, TSR Hobbies. So today we're going to be talking about Top Secret, which is the world's first espionage-themed role-playing game. So what's interesting, this is originally published in 1980, and by this point, TSR, this is the sixth game that they're going to publish. So they've published 5 games before this. We've talked about all of these games before, but we have Dungeons & Dragons from 1974. Again, this is the later printing. The original one had the wood grain box, but originally published in 1974. Then you have Boot Hill and Empire of the Petal Throne. So kind of depending on how you look at it, it's the second and third games published by TSR. It really sort of depends. This is a later edition of Boot Hill. This is the 1979 second edition. I don't have the first edition, but I have talked about the first edition before. But these are the second and third games in any event. Okay, so Western and fantasy, or if you really want to quibble semantics, you could say science fantasy, but that's kind of the genre that they're going for. Then in 1976, we have the fourth game published by TSR. That's Metamorphosis Alpha, science fantasy role-playing game. Some people say it's the first science fiction role-playing game. So there's 2 issues with that. One, Starfaring beats it to publication by a little bit. So Starfaring is technically the first science fiction role. Well, it's not technically, it is the first science fiction role-playing game. This also is much closer to science fantasy than science fiction. So you can definitely say it's the first science fantasy role-playing game that's published. But again, that depends on your definition of the word fantasy, or, science fantasy. Then 1978, you have the publication of Gamma World by TSR. Science fantasy, also post-apocalyptic. Okay, so very early on. Now, 1977, they took a break. They didn't publish anything. And then in 1979, I already mentioned this, but that's the second edition of Boot Hill. Okay, so they are moving beyond traditional fantasy. They're doing, Western genre and science fantasy, post-apocalyptic. But you also have the role-playing game competitors that have developed in the wake of the publication of Dungeons & Dragons, and they're also moving beyond the fantasy genre. Now, a lot of the games that come out are going to lean into fantasy, and they're going to compete directly with Dungeons & Dragons, and many of them are being created with the goal of starting with D&D and then improving it. So nowadays, what you'd sort of almost call like a fantasy heartbreaker, but a lot of popular games get started with that way, because people start with Dungeons & Dragons and they say, I don't like these things, I'm going to change it and make it better, right? Better. When I say this, I don't mean that they're not better. I just that's the goal of a lot of these games starting out. But you also have people moving beyond the fantasy genre, beyond Westerns. There are other games that are being published where, for example, just to show you how far things get, Bunnies and Burrows is being published, where essentially that is a role-playing game of the book Watership Down with the IP filed off because they didn't have that license. But you've got On Guard published as early as 1975 that is featuring adventures in kind of a Three Musketeers era, Paris. But you've also got the first licensed role-playing game. You've got Flash Gordon and the Warriors of Mongo. So Sword and Planet, science fiction-y, I guess you could call it that, or also science fantasy. You've got this first superhero role-playing game, Superhero 2044. So that's a superhero role-playing game. You've got a very early attempt at a universal system with Legacy, um, which is intended to be able to play in different genres, but it really kind of leans into prehistoric. You've got pirate games with Buccaneer. You've got feudal Japan with Bushido. You've got Commando, a combat game from World War II up until, the modern day, but, a role-playing game of like combat and military action. You've got Gangster with an exclamation point, the first, uh, game during that kind of like 1920s era, Prohibition era. And you've got Dark Age games like Heroes. Okay, Dark Ages in Europe. Okay, so you have all these other genres. So people are starting to dip their toe into this idea that like we can expand beyond, um, the traditional fantasy genre in role playing games. And you do have some science fiction games. So you could argue that Commando is getting into that modern age, but nobody was really hitting into this idea of like espionage and spy games until Top Secret comes out in again 1980. Now mine is a later printing. Mine is the second edition of the game, but it's the 1983 printing. And the way you can tell that, well, one, it says 1983, but you can also just immediately tell from the logo. So the original first printing of the game had the wizard logo, the wizard with the holding the wand, and then this has moved to the a later mid 80s, early to mid 80s TSR logo, which has been adapted by a lot of people. There's a very, famous within the community. It's a very niche community, but a famous logo for the OSR, which stands for Old School Renaissance, or it might stand for Old School Revolution, or it might stand for Old School Rules, or it might stand for Old School something that starts with an R, whatever you want to say that stands for. But it has developed a logo that was based on this because this was kind of a period in time where a lot of people started to get into D&D. So 1983 is when the Beckme editions are released, the famous red box for D&D. So there's a huge contingent of people that kind of started during that time period. But in any event, this is a later printing. Now, and it's a later edition. So this is a second edition game. Second edition Top Secret comes out in 1981, actually. And then again, this is a later printing from 1983 of second edition. There are some differences from first edition, but they're very, very close. So I'm going to use my second edition game, 1983 printing, to talk about the game. And then I'll just kind of point out some areas where it was a little bit different from the first printing. However, before we get started with any of that, we need to talk a little bit about the person who created this game for 3 or more players, ages 12 to adult. And it's by Merle Rasmussen. Now, I have talked about him before. If you saw my video on the history of all 35 RPG box sets published by TSR, I did talk about Top Secret for a little bit in that game. And in that video, I do talk about why I have the second module or second adventure module that for Top Secret in my box set instead of the original one. So the original one would have been mission module TS001, Operation, I always stumble over this because it's in German. I think Spreckenhaltestelle, I believe it's how it's pronounced. And that was the original adventure module that was included in this box set. Very bold of them to go with an almost, to Americans at least, unpronounceable word. But in any event, that was the original module that was included in this. And in that other video, I talk about why I don't have that and why I have this. It's, I think, kind of a funny story all these years later. So check that out. But so I did talk about Merle, but so Merle Rasmussen, first off, he is still around. He's still with us, which is awesome because he's one of the very early employees of TSR, one of the very early role-playing game creators. And I think it was GaryCon that he's going to be out in 2024 where he's on a panel or he's doing like a meet and greet. He's doing something where like you can sign up and like get to meet him and talk to him and stuff, which is awesome. I unfortunately am not going to GaryCon this year. So if you are going, maybe tell him you saw this video and say hi. That'd be awesome. But anyway, I also like Merle because his middle initial M here stands for Martin. So Merle was he graduated from high school in 1975. So based on that, that's going to put him age-wise, roughly about, let's say, about 13 years or so after Gary Gygax is born. I might be doing my math wrong there, but it also makes him about 13 years older than I am. So, you can kind of figure out the age differences there. But in any event, Merle graduates from high school, and then he's going to college in Iowa. And while he's there, he starts developing an espionage simulation game. And it would seem that he must have come across Dungeons and Dragons at some point, because he ends up writing to TSR and saying that he's developed this game and asking if they want to look at it. So Mike Carr from TSR, we have talked about Mike Carr before, mostly in that video on the 35 box sets, because he's the creator of Fight in the Skies and then later Dawn Patrol, which is kind of like an evolution of Fight in the Skies. But Mike Carr from TSR writes back and says, like, okay, let's talk about this. Show us what you have. And so it takes a while, but by 1976, they're in communication to talk about this game. And by 1978, TSR has agreed that, yes, we're going to, publish a game like this. So it goes to having the working name of Top Secret, which is the name that we end up with. And what's happening during this time period is that in 1979, TSR has started to create new divisions within the company, new branches to work on things. And one of them was the design division, which was headed by Lawrence Schick and Gene Wells. Or I don't know if it was headed by them, but they were the first two people that was in there. Now, Lawrence Schick is going to go on to then hire Tom Moldvay and Dave Cook, who are very instrumental in the BX version of D&D. And then Dave Cook has a very long and storied career at TSR. That's a story for another day. So it seems like I would guess that Merle Rasmussen was part of the design department. And then what happens is it is then handed off to another department that was created in the late 70s or early 80s. Now, this comes out, I think, in February of 1980, but in any event, called the Development Department. And their job was to take stuff that was created by the design department as a rough draft. And then they would take it and refine it and put it into a format that could be published. So the original person that led the the development division of TSR was Alan Hammock. Okay, so both of them work on a lot of different products for TSR over the years. I'm just going to be talking about Top Secret today, but they both, again, have a pretty long and storied history with the company. So they have decided to publish this game, again, because of the popularity of the espionage genre. So very interesting looking at the box. So the first, photographed cover art for a TSR product. So rather than a painting, and then here on the back, you see what the original contents were. So the book, and then again, that original adventure there, Spreckenholzstelle. I'm sorry, I can't say that. I should just say codename Pisces. It would be easier. And then it came with two, D percentile dice, which at the time, again, were D20s. So we're going to get into that later. But D10s, for those of you who don't know, they don't come around for a while. Okay, and I did talk about this on my last game, but essentially these were numbered 1 through 9, and there was a dark colored die and like a white colored die. Okay, and so you used 1 for the 10s and 1 for the 1s, and so you rolled them. So if you rolled 00 on the 10s die, and then you rolled a 3, that was 3%. And if you rolled a 30 on the 10s die, or a 3 in this case because it's numbered, they didn't have 00, so it's numbered 0 to 9. So if you rolled a 0 on the 10s die and a 3 on the 1s die, that was your 3%. If you rolled a 3 on the 10s die and a 0 on the 1s die, that's 30%. So the one thing that always trips people up is that if you rolled 00, that's not 0%, it's 100%. And the reason it's 100% is because you're calculating a number from 1 to 100. You're not calculating a number from 0 to 99. So there's no 0. Unless you're playing a system that is calculating numbers from 0 to 99%. It's just not common, right? Most games are generating a number from 1 to 100. So the 00 is 100%. That's just how dice like this works. And it actually tells you that in the game here. Okay, so I don't have the original dice that came in this because So the short version is I bought this box with just the rule book. I got this, I got the rule book, and then I got the character sheet was in here. And then that's all I got. I didn't get the module, and there's a whole story why I didn't get the module again in that other book. Okay, so there's your cover again, repeated here. And then we see the foreword. Now, this is going to be the original foreword. It's dated from January of 1980. Alan Hammock writing the foreword. However, the typeface and layout is different. So one of the changes that they made in the second edition, in addition to kind of adding a couple of new rules or refining some rules, they also completely changed the layout and the typography, the fonts that they were using. So it ends up changing like where things fall on the page and things like that for a couple things. All right, so we see the credits here. We've got Merle Rasmussen for game design development. We've got editing and layout by Alan Hammock. And then for the second edition, we've added Evan Robinson, and then a second edition editing and layout. So again, that's talking about, that change in the formatting and the typography. We've got second edition proofs, John Pickens and Edward Sollers. And then you've got the module editor, Mike Carr. So that would be the original module. I'm going to say codename Pisces that was included in here. And then you've got your helpful suggestions here. A lot of names that you're going to recognize. Brian Bloom, we've talked about before. Dave Cook, I just mentioned. Harold Johnson. I'm not reading all of these, but some of these names you'll recognize right away. Skip Williams, Gene Wells. Okay. Let's talk about the art. So we've talked about most of these folks before, and I'm just going to kind of point them out as we go through here. I think the one we maybe haven't mentioned yet is Darlene. She's got a great history with the company. Very, very popular artist among old school people. She's got some great work in especially the first edition Dungeon Master's Guide. And I think I talked about her at that point when we talked about that book in the past. Okay, so that's your kind of your forward and your credits. All right. So then we've got this great work here by, anytime you see this, that's Jeff D. So that's how he signs his name. And also you can tell it's Jeff D because we've got our flared pants here. I've talked about that before. It's just a funny product of the time. So much of Jeff D's work, and I'm not making fun of him. He's a great, fun artist of the time, but a lot of his work has that characteristic bell-bottom kind of pants that were very popular during that time period. Although by this time, they're kind of starting to fade out of popularity. Okay. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about when we talk about this game is the idea of why develop a new system? Why develop a new game when you can just take an existing game and play it, right? So I know a lot of people, and this happened a ton in the third edition days when the D20 system kind of became ubiquitous in the role-playing game community. And then it happens today with fifth edition as well, where I'll see folks or talk to folks on Twitter, for example, and they'll say, I don't need a new game because I have fifth edition and I'm comfortable with that and it can work with any kind of thing. Well, yes. But think about, you could have played a spy game with original Dungeons and Dragons, take out magic users and clerics. Okay. So all the spells, all the magic items, anything magical in nature, take that out. And then you'd have to add in rules for firearms. You'd probably need some more robust rules for hand-to-hand combat. And, you'd have to add some things to get there, but you could use the bones of that to play a spy game. But why? If you're making that many changes to the game and you're trying to, what's the phrase, like stick a square peg into a round hole, whatever that phrase is, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you start with, what's important about the genre that we're trying to emulate? What are the key touchstones, the, almost cliches? And then how do we take those and turn them into meaningful game mechanics that add excitement to play? So the key elements of the spy genre, I mean, there's a few, but the ones that immediately jump to mind are going to be things like firearm combat. That's a big part of it. Having modern firearms. If you're playing a modern spy game, you need rules to talk about, ducking and shooting and moving and dodging and long range and short range and snipers and different kinds of weapons and automatic weapons and all that kind of stuff. That's going to need to be something that you're going to need to have. You're also going to need to have rules for more detailed hand-to-hand combat. So in D&D, you can use unarmed combat, but there's no distinguishing between, like, say, someone punching you and someone kicking you, or grappling, or things like. Now, they add some rules for grappling and kind of that stuff later, but it's not an inherent part of the system because the system isn't built to really explore the idea of hand-to-hand combat in D&D. Okay, so what it's really built for is exploration. That's what D&D is, exploration and magic, right? So this game isn't about exploration, so we don't need all those rules for that. Don't waste space in the rule book on exploration, and talk about the things that matter: hand-to-hand combat, projectile, firearms combat. But also, one of the things, if you're looking at something like a James Bond book or movie, one of the things that he has going for him is that he is famous within the spy community. Even if people don't necessarily know what he looks like, they've heard of his name. They know the name, and they know to beware of this person, which can give him an edge if people then discover that that's who they're dealing with. Also, he performs feats of daring do that the average person couldn't accomplish. And a lot of times he accomplishes it by luck. So those are some elements that you might want to try to emulate. Keep using that word emulate, but you understand what I'm saying. You might want to include in a game that is exploring the genre of spies and spycraft. And so when you start looking at it that way, it makes sense that they would develop a brand new system rather than trying to refit and retcon an existing system like D&D. So those changes also then come about with the idea of the percentile dice. And you're going to see how percentile dice and percentiles in general make a huge impact on how play on this works, much different than using the standard polyhedral dice that we use in D&D. So somebody pointed out in the comments, like on one of my previous videos, and I had actually never thought about it before, but essentially for this period in TSR history, and it totally is true, you sort of have two different mechanics, dice mechanics, that is, for their games. So you have the standard suite of the original 5 polyhedral dice, the 4, 6, 8, 12, and 20. So you have that with D&D, and then games that work like D&D, such as Metamorphosis Alpha, Gamma World, a little bit of Empire of the Petal Throne, although their statistics or their ability scores are determined by percentile dice, but they do use the other dice for other purposes. And then later on for things like even Buck Rogers in the 25th Century is built on the second edition advanced D&D chassis, which uses that standard suite of those dice. Okay, but then starting with one of, if not the second role-playing game published by TSR, which is Boot Hill, 1975. That moves to percentile dice. And one of the reasons is because it is built mainly as a man-to-man, it's a skirmish game, as someone else corrected me on, but it's almost player versus player. They don't need all those other dice, for one thing, but some of the systems that it's built on, or the war game history that those come out of, do tend to use percentile dice a little more, even though, again, the D10s didn't exist at the time. So you have Boot Hill, but then you have this game, you have Top Secret, and then you're going to move into other games that rely on percentiles, Gangbusters and Star Frontiers and Marvel Superheroes, and then getting into stuff like Conan and Indiana Jones. So they kind of diverge into two different ways. And all of the percentile games don't have the same game mechanics, but they do tend to kind of split into, are we going to use all of the dice, or are we just going to use D10s? So as an example, unlike other companies, TSR doesn't make like a D6 game. They don't do that. So all of the dice, or D10s, or D20s, or D percentile, however you want to say it. Okay, so let's jump into this book and start talking about some of the mechanics. I'm not going to go page by page. I'm not going to read every rule, but I just kind of want to talk about some of the interesting things that are in here. So we've got this introduction. This is written by Merle Rasmussen, and it is written kind of almost like as an in-game artifact. So he's writing it as though he works at a spy agency, which is kind of interesting. But then when we move past that, we get to one of the first times that you see in a TSR product, the how to use this book, where it gets into the idea of like you're playing a role-playing game. It explains what that means and how there's different types of players and characters in this and who's going to do what. And you don't see that a lot in early TSR games. So, but this is 1980. Now, again, this one came out in 1981. You can see here the second edition, February of 1981. So it talks about how to use the dice. And this is where I was just talking about where it says, see at the bottom here, a throw of 0, 0 would be read as 100. So a 0 on the 10 die and a 0 on the 1s die is read as 100. Okay, and it talks about some additional equipment you might need. This is all pretty standard stuff, the number of players. So this is kind of getting away from some of the big chances or the big groups of characters that, say, D&D had. So it specifically says it works better with a smaller number of players because the more characters you have, the less your chance of success because there's just too many people running around. So it says it works really well with, say, the administrator, which in this game is what we would now call a dungeon master or referee in Dungeons and Dragons. And here it's called administrator. And it says maybe just 1 or 2 agents. So it talks about that. Got some art here. And then it gives you your character construction and your personal traits. So these are your ability scores. And once again, they're not going with the standard 6 from Dungeons and Dragons because we need ability scores that are going to help us emulate the genre of spycraft and spy fiction. So you've got physical strength. Now, I don't really know why they went out of their way to call it physical strength here because there's no mental strength. They could have just called it strength, but they called it physical strength. You've got charm, willpower, courage, knowledge, and coordination. Now, these are very, very similar to the ability scores in D&D. Obviously, charm is close to charisma. However, I think that the way it's described and using charm, I think, is more indicative of a spy genre than just calling it charisma. Willpower, kind of wisdom, but more specific, again, to the genre. Courage, is the one that's kind of like probably maybe a mix between, say, maybe charisma and wisdom in D&D, but, very, very relevant for a game like this. Knowledge would be your intelligence, and then coordination would be your dexterity. Okay, so then it talks about rolling for your scores. And then very much like in Boot Hill that we talked about in the last video, this wants your characters to be a little bit better than average. And so if your die rolls are low, you're going to add a bonus. So if you roll between a 1 and a 25, you're going to add a plus 25 bonus, which means your minimum ability score is going to be a 26. So that's the lowest it's going to be. Now, if you roll really high, you don't add anything, right? Okay. So it talks about that. And then it talks about, this is very interesting. It's one of the things that this game is, it shouldn't be complicated. It's just people aren't good at math, right? But the idea is that when it says, if you take a loss to an ability score, it'll give you the loss in a percentage. So if your coordination is 60 and it tells you that you lose 20%, it's not 20 percentage points. So you're not losing 60 minus 20 to be 40. You're losing 20% of 60. So your 60 is also a percentage, so it can get confusing unless you just kind of understand. Just look at the 60 as a straight number, and you're going to lose 20% of 60, which would be 12, right? So 60 minus 12 is 48. So that's what you'd get if you lost 20% of 60. So I think a lot of people kind of forget that that's how that works, but it's like this throughout the game. And that's a pretty easy example. Calculating 20% of 60 is not difficult, but calculating, 33% of 51, you need a calculator, right? I mean, you could do it in your head if you're super smart, but most likely you're going to need a calculator to figure out these percentages. Okay. Now, this is also interesting, and it's the first time that we've seen it in a TSR game where you're going to have derivative stats or derivative abilities. They call them secondary personal traits. But what these are is it's taking your ability scores and creating new ones that are derived from that by adding them together and dividing them by 2. So your offense is a combination of your coordination and your courage divided by 2. Your deception is courage and charm divided by 2. Your evasion is your charm and coordination divided by 2. Deactivation is knowledge and coordination divided by 2. And then physical strength and willpower divided by 10 is your life level. Okay, so that is basically how much damage you can take. Those, in D&D terms, that's your hit points. Okay, so it can go up over the course of the game if either your physical strength or your willpower go up, but that's really the only way that's going to increase. Okay, then you have your movement value, which is derived from your physical strength plus your willpower plus your coordination. That's going to give you your movement. Then you're going to calculate your tertiary personal traits, which use both primary and secondary. So your hand-to-hand combat value, which later they're just going to call HTH, is your evasion plus your physical strength. And then your surprise value is your deception plus your evasion. And then you round all fractions to the nearest whole number. Unlike in, say, 3rd edition and 5th edition, where you always round up, in this case, or I think that you always round up, pretty sure if I remember correctly. In this case, everything is rounded as it normally would be in regular math. Okay. So, and then you can figure out your height. And then it says, your other characteristics that you can add, you add them yourself. Okay. So there's your height. And then it says to figure out your age, you're going to roll a 10-sided die 3 times and then add 12. So your starting age is going to be between 15 to 42. Okay, and then it tells you what happens if you're older or younger, blah, blah, blah. For your handedness, you use the actual handedness right or left of the individual player. Figure out if you have glasses, roll a d10, 1 to 3 wear glasses, 7 to 10 you don't, 4 to 10 you don't. And then you have your experience points. You start at 0. They're given out by the administrator. Okay, then other statistics, weight, sex, national origin, etc. may be chosen by the player or by the administrator. This is important for later in a supplement we're going to talk about, which is the top secret companion. All right. And then you figure out your knowledge value and the maximum number of languages that you can know. And then you're going to look at Appendix 3 for the major languages of the world for a selection of the languages. Okay. So that's basically how you figure out your character. Now, you've got areas of knowledge. These are skills. But of course, it's TSR, so rather than call them skills, we're going to call them areas of knowledge. Just like in late 1st and then in 2nd edition advanced D&D, you don't have skills, you have non-weapon proficiencies. So here we have areas of knowledge, but these are essentially skills, and you see the list here. And you roll for these. So you're not picking them, you're rolling. The only ones you get to pick is if you roll 76 to 100, then the player gets to pick. Otherwise, you're going to just roll them. Okay, and then you get a rating for the score for a specific superior area of knowledge determined by percentage roll, and then you're going to add these numbers. Okay, so it talks a little bit about that, and then you have your bureau classification. So what's interesting is that when Merle Rasmussen originally started working on this simulation game, it was known as, I think it was called a programmed game. It was a very specific style of game, but it's very flowchart based. You have tables and tables of information that you're looking at, and the outcome of desired action is going to come out of looking at these tables and comparing rows and columns and seeing what's going to happen, right? So that's kind of how the game started, and you can see that those kernels of that early game throughout Top Secret. But because TSR has started to develop the role-playing game genre, you get elements of the original D&D creeping in as well. So that's all to say, these bureau classifications, these are technically like classes, okay? So you have 3 are for player characters. Section 1 is for administration. You really don't need that, but it's just, they're trying to be fun, right? So that is for the administrator, again, the referee, the judge, the dungeon master, the game master, okay? Then you have investigation, and they have level titles, which is fun. That's a holdover from D&D, and very different from later types of game design, but very common with TSR class and level games of this time. I wouldn't necessarily call this a class and level game. It's a hybrid between a skill-based and a class and level game, but different classes have different experience points. So investigation has one of the highest to move to the next level. So former scout, tail examiner, you've got all those, right? Then you have confiscation. That's going to be kind of like your thief. Shoplifter, pilfer, swindler, click, burglar. Okay, and they only need 400 experience points to get to level 2. And then again, you see the investigation needs 2,000. And then section 00. I wonder why they called it that. It's just a fun, nod to Ian Fleming and James Bond. So this is assassination, and they only need 500 experience points to get to the second level. All right. Now, what's interesting is that by the time they get to 10th level, all of them are at 20,000 experience points, and they all need 10,000 to get to the next level. So if you look at these two back here, you'll see the investigators at 20,000 at 10th level, and then the confiscator is at 20,000 at 10th level. Okay. So then you've got some more fun art here. This is by Diesel. So they called him Diesel. That's David S. LaForce, but because his initials spelled DSL, he was kind of commonly his nickname was Diesel. Okay, so that's some art by him. Then it talks about equipping the character, and it talks about how much things weigh and how much they cost. And you've got your standard equipment here. So this is kind of fun. And it basically says that the cost is assuming that your agent works for an organization, which is going to give you a break. So these aren't like real world costs. Okay, so that goes through here and you get all this kind of stuff. Then you've got your tools of the trade. So all this like standard spy stuff, lockpicks and bulletproof vests and cameras and makeup kits and parachutes, piano wire. So, very, very relevant to the type of genre that you're going to be playing here. Then you've got your weapons and ammunition. So you've got your standard hand-to-hand stuff, billy clubs, brass knuckles, but you've got firearms, which are on their own weapons table, but then you've got like the kind of magazines that you would use for those, silencers, stilettos, switchblades, telescopic sights. Okay, and then you've got your different caliber of ammunition here, and then your different gauge, and then your special weapons, air guns, anesthetic, boomerangs, fusing cords, light intensifier goggles, plastic explosives, sleeping gas, a lot of fun stuff in here. Very, very, it's really fun to kind of come up with uses for using this kind of stuff in a spy type game. Then you've got your communications, all wave radios and hidden transmit mics, that kind of stuff. And then over here, this is going to describe how all that stuff works, your surveillance equipment, what it means and how to use it. Okay. Some more art here by our friend David S. LaForce Diesel. All right. So it goes on with the special equipment, and then it gets into the game systems. It talks about distance and time. So in this particular one, interestingly, time is broken up into a turn, which is 5 phases. And a turn is 5 seconds, and a phase is 1 second. And then it says you can use paper and pencil to tally your time. And the admin has to monitor the passage of time as he or she sees fit. Okay. So you've got some more art here by Diesel, and then it talks about movements, and you've got crawling, walking, running and dodging, wading and swimming. So some of this seems very similar to Boot Hill, but it's just like it's more detailed. If you saw my video on the Boot Hill game, it talks about encumbrance and vehicle movement. So that's on here, and then you've got all your kinds of vehicles here. Okay, and then you have preparing a mission and the different kinds of missions. So again, very table heavy, but in here you have a list of what I guess they thought was sort of an exhaustive list of the kind of missions that you would go on. Assassinations, muggings, defection, protection, blackmail, extortion, kidnapping, arson, bombing, prison break-in, jailbreak-in, rescue, hijacking, skyjacking, piracy. Okay, you see all of them here, right? And then it tells you how many experience points you're going to earn if you complete that mission. And then you're going to get your 100-point bureau bonus if, for example, if you are in the assassination bureau and you complete an assassination, you get a bonus that you won't get if you are in the infiltration or confiscation bureaus, as an example. All right, and then it talks about payment because you're going to get paid. And then you've got all these special codes here, which are described down here, like, the identity of a human target, the last known location, the destination, the identity of the object target, number of persons at the target site, all these different things that are going to affect the success or failure of the mission and what could happen with a complication. Okay. And then this defines all these different kinds of missions. So you can see this is very detailed. And again, it's not going over stuff like, not to keep bringing back D&D, but this is the company that created Dungeons and Dragons, which is about that exploration. How many rations do you have? How many torches do you have? And how many hirelings did you have to complete this thing? And like, how much gold are you going to take out of the junk? This doesn't deal with any of that. We're talking about equipment here, and it's very detailed. And then the kind of missions that you can go on, and again, very, very detailed. Talks a little bit about non-player characters, and then you've got some art here. It's not signed. I think This is by Bill Willingham, just by comparing it to some of his other art. Okay, then you've got your contacts and how to make a contact in the game. So this is really fun because it has different methods that you can use to contact to like make connection. And based on, do you want to use force? And then it tells you you're going to use, your physical strength plus your hand-to-hand combat value. But if you're going to fool them, you're going to use your knowledge first and then your specific area of knowledge. And then, to fascinate, you use charm. To dazzle, you use coordination. So there's all these different kinds of ways that you can get a new contact, which is kind of fun. It's not just for the high charm people or, in D&D terms, high charisma people. Anybody can make a contact and they can use the ability that they're best at to try to do so, which I thought was kind of a fun mechanic there. Then you've got your contact reaction table. So you've got your agent trait value and those traits that we talked about earlier, and then your contact trait value. You're going to compare them on this chart to figure out the success of working with that contact. So you see here, A would be the contact will listen to the agent, will try to answer anything the agent asks and try to do anything the agent requests. And then that goes all the way down to the contact will not listen to the agent and will attempt to engage in hand-to-hand combat. That's the worst thing that can happen, right? And then everything in between. And then you can bribe them, and then there's a table for doing bribing and like how to do it. And the bribe factor is the monetary bribe offered divided by the contact's willpower value, and that's your bribe factor. Okay, so you have all of that. Got some more art here by our friend Jeff D. And then you've got your random answers. And he says, if no one really knows the answer to a yes or no question and the admin isn't prepared to make one up, roll a die. And on a 1 to 5, the answer is yes. And on a 6 to 10, it's no. And then also it's like if you're looking for a location and the admin doesn't know where the location is, oh, well, here's your handy table that you can just roll on here. And that way the admin can keep the game moving without trying to, strain too hard to think of something. Just roll on the table and then make it up as you go, right? So it's kind of a fun little addition. Talks about guards and using guards, which includes police and enemy weaponry and what they might have and what kind of ammunition they might have. So here's some art here by Errol Otis. You see it signed there. And then you've got police weaponry and random determination of police weaponry and the weaponry that they would carry in a vehicle, the police cuffing table. So you're rolling percentage to figure out, are you going to be cuffed? And if so, are you gagged also? And is it your hands and your ankles or just your hands? Very table heavy game. Unlike we talked about, Tunnels and Trolls where they try to get away from tables, this one is all about using those tables. Okay, so this is art by Jim Rosloff. Great. That's a great piece of art. I love the ink work there and the shading. Okay. Then it talks about experience points. So basically, you get experience points for completing the mission and you add your bonus if it's your agency bonus. But then you divide it by the level that you're at. So if you got 600 points for a mission and you were level 5, you're going to divide that 600 by 5 and you're going to earn 120 experience points. So that's how it works. And then your payment also factors in your level and the target level and all that kind of stuff. And then what you can do with your experience points is there's a rule in here where you're dividing the total experience points that you have by 100, and that number is what you can add to your ability scores, and you can split it up or add it all to one, and like there's just different rules for that. But that's how you improve your ability scores, is doing that. Okay, then we're going to get into combat. So this book is 64 pages long. We're now on page 19, which is going to get into combat, and it's going to use up a huge part of this book. So it talks about your field of fire. So if you are in missile combat, projectile combat, firearm combat, whatever you want to call it, this is where you can fire. So you can't fire here or here behind you unless you turn, okay? It talks about surprise and how that's determined, and then the first shot determination. So that's very important in this particular game. And as we can tell that because there's this huge chart here, or table, whatever you want to call it, with all these different factors that are going to impact who gets the first shot. Okay. And then it talks about automatic weapons and what happens when you have that. Basically, it's, not surprising. Each shot you take reduces your chance to hit. So until you kind of steady yourself and kind of reset back to your base value. Then it talks about movement during projectile combat and what happens when you have that. There's another picture by Jeff D. Okay, and then it talks about how to use the weapons chart. So here's your weapons chart, and each weapon has, a code, it has a name, it has a projectile weapons value or a PWV, and then it has your range modifiers for point blank, short, medium, and long. So it's just all this stuff in here, very, very detailed, because again, firearms are important to this kind of fictional genre. All right, so you've got more and more. Got another piece here by Diesel. So if you saw my videos where I talked about, very specifically about the module S3 Expedition to the Barrier Peaks, and I did a whole video on that. A lot of the artwork in there was done by this guy, and you can just tell the way that Dave LaForce shades his pieces. It just jumps right out at you once you kind of know that that's what you're looking at. You've got tables here of weapon weights, and then how to determine where you hit. Where's the head? Then you've got your movement of the shooter and the movement of the target, which affects it. And the number of wounds that you have makes it harder for you to shoot. Okay. So now here we are on page 24. So we've got 5 pages and we're still doing how to shoot in combat. Okay. So you've got more and more weapon rest on a solid object, vehicular movement, drop phones, shooter stationary, or drop prone. Sorry, not drop phone. And then you just keep going as your shooter wounded in the gun or hand arm. How do you hit weapons if you are trying to do that? Which a lot of times it comes up as an optional roll. I think just kind of accidentally, depending on what you roll. Your misfires and your jams, your reloadings, and then you've got your example of projectile combat. Starts here on page 25, and it goes all the way through this entire page 26. Okay, then you get to hand-to-hand combat and how to do that. Okay, and all the different actions that you can take. And then you've got some nice artwork here by Jeff D. Note the flared pants at the ankles. All right. And then types of allowable combat. So one of the changes that was made between first and second edition Top Secret was the combat system, and very specifically the hand-to-hand combat system. So knife fighting changes between the 2 editions. There was a wrestling thing that was like its own thing in first edition Top Secret that just gets folded into general hand-to-hand combat in second edition. So it makes some changes, and that does affect the layout of like what things are on what page, in addition to the typeface and the typography, the fonts that we talked about before. Okay, and then you've got your untrained combat table. Nice piece here by Jeff D. And then you've got one up here by Bill Willingham, famous comic book illustrator, artist. Okay, there's another piece down here. Now this is by Diesel, and you can tell it's by Diesel because it's the license plate of this car over here, DSL. It's kind of fun. All right, so you've got your knife fighting. That was a very big difference between first and second edition. Boxing, judo. So you see, hand-to-hand is very important in here. It's not just like D&D where all unarmed combat just does the same damage no matter what. This is very much broken out into different styles of hand-to-hand combat, which is, again, important for that cinematic action that you're looking at. A lot of these spy stories featured like these, almost like super spies that have like these incredible martial arts skills. And so it's important to be able to have a system that can reflect that in the mechanics of the game. So very important for that. Again, I'm assuming this is Bill Willingham here. This one's not signed, and it's probably a much bigger piece that just got cropped for inclusion. Now, this down here is by Errol Otis because we see his initials, EO. All right, so hand-to-hand combat still continues. Okay, so now we started combat on page 19. We're now on page 33. We finally finished combat. We're getting to miscellaneous rules. So damage from falling, bulletproof equipment, different kinds of non-player characters. You've got security systems with alarms, traps, and locks, lockpick sets, forced entry. So this is kind of like other stuff that might come up during the game. That's it's likely to come up. Explosives, grenades, underwater combat. All right. And then you've got some more art here by Errol Otis. Arousing human or animal guards. Okay, just keeps going on. Animal guard reaction table. Okay. Bullet use against vehicles, table, just tons of tables in this. Gambling, disguises, goes through all of that. Anesthetics, gases, designing an environment. So this is just a good section for an admin in this particular game to kind of do stuff here. All right, optional rules, fame and fortune. This is key. Probably one of the best parts that was developed for this game, but these are rules that allow a player to affect the outcome of the dice or of something that happened, like being injured during combat, using fame, like how popular, how well known they are, as well as fortune or luck. It even says luck here. So when you start the game, basically what's going to happen is the admin's going to roll a d10 in secret. And the number that you get is how many fame points or luck points that agent has. And the agent can use them to change a poor outcome. So it says, in a life or death situation, the agent may expend 1 fortune point to reduce a fatal wound to the point where the agent still has 1 life level point remaining. So it gives an example of someone who only has 5 life points and he takes 8 points of damage. Rather than dying, the player announces that he's going to spend a fortune point. Then the admin checks to make sure that the agent still has any left. And then finding that the agent does, he reduces the injury to a serious incision instead, and it only causes 4 points. So the agent still has 1 point left. And then it says in hand-to-hand combat, an agent can expend a fortune point to remain 1 point above unconsciousness. But fortune points are never regenerated or replaced. So once they're used, they're gone forever. And the thing is, the player doesn't know how many they have. They might only have 1 because it's rolled on a roll of 1 to 10. So only the admin knows how many they have left. Now, fame points work the same way, except that they do gain more, and they gain them based on what level they're at. So a 4th level agent has 4 fame points. Now, once they're spent, but then they can gain more as they gain a new level. All right, so it's starting to get a little dark, but I'm going to try to finish this up really quick before I get to the next part of the video. But here's your optional rules. So we talked about the fame and fortune. Then you have arrest by police and what happens, called shots, which is kind of fun. Now, this always cracks me up. So let's check out this art here by this person. So there's a book that I first got at the library when I was a kid, How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. And I loved that book, and I begged my mom to get it for me, and she finally did. On my blog, I have a story about this book, but I actually wrote an English essay about this book. But just really quick, let's go to page 82. Just look this up. So check out that picture right there. Then check out this one. Now, obviously, the guy's face is different. Okay, the clothing's a little different, but just even if you just look at the hand and how it's on the gun and the drawing of the gun, now the perspective is slightly different, but I would say it's pretty clear that people were looking at. I'm not saying it's a copy. I'm not saying they did anything wrong. I'm just saying they were probably using this book. If you're an artist or a comics fan, you've never read this book, definitely check it out, How to Draw Comics the Marvel Way. But in any event, the picture jumped out at me, one of the first times that I ever saw it. All right, so then we go back through here. We've got our temporary losses chart and what that means, and permanent losses, another piece of artwork here by Bill Willingham. Okay, and then you've got gun design. I mean, again, very, very detailed in here. So you can see the things that are important in this kind of game. Complications, surveillance, occupational hazards, being captured by the enemy, sneak attack damage. So this is fun. Sneak attack. If you're a 5th edition player, that probably doesn't mean anything to you, but if you're an old school player, you know in Dungeons and Dragons, the original thief ability was called backstab. And that sneak attack didn't enter the vernacular for games published by TSR or by Wizards of the Coast until I don't know if Wizards of the Coast used it first in any of their acquisition of TSR games, but in D&D terms, sneak attack was not used until the 2000 release of 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons. So I think it's fun to see it here in 1980, 20 years before that, in a completely different game. And then it talks about, how it works and that kind of thing. All right. So now this is another part that this is new. for the second edition of the game. So there were no animals table there was no animals table in the first edition of Top Secret. So this is a new section, which again is going to impact the layout of the rest of these pages here. Some more fun artwork here by Bill Willingham. You've your execution table and your chance of survival. And then you've got your campaign rules. So this is talking about how to create a spy or an espionage network, or what they call an octopus. And so this is kind of really fun, and it talks about like different kinds of factors that go into creating things like this, and communication links. And you've got your operators and your administrators and your spies, and then your cutouts, which are essentially your background characters, right? And talks all about that. It talks about how to build buildings and how expensive they are if you want to construct like a secret hideout for your spy organization. Okay, then you've got your Appendix 1, the Q section. Again, a little nod to Ian Fleming there. And this is all your fantastic technological devices, surveillance equipment, assassination types of equipment, cigarette guns and laser guns and explosive devices, special kind of vehicles, and all these cool things that you can add to your motorcycles or your cars, or even to your boats and your helicopters, to add different kinds of cool things to them. Then you have your section here on how to use the agent's dossier. That's your character sheet. So that came in the box, and it's just explained to you how to use this. So that was one of my guys, Hans Dietrich Klein. And then it just lays it all out. And then you've got your appendix here for the major languages of the world. So this is a big deal of like, what language could you speak? You figured out how many languages you could speak earlier, but this is the table of languages that you can pick from. And then you've got some work here. This is by Darlene. Talked about her briefly earlier. And then, very, very cool, because she's one of, if not the first, she's one of the first female artists working in the role-playing game field. Okay, so then you've got your espionage-related organizations. Okay, so this is actually really cool. This is a list as of 1980 of all the known spy organizations in the world. All right, and some of them wouldn't be in existence anymore, but it's giving it to you here anyway, because you might want to use them in a historical game or something like that, right? So I always thought that was really fun. I spent a lot of time reading through this. You've got some more artwork down here for your spy organizations. That is by, you can see it right there, Errol Otis, which always cracked me up because he was very well known for doing like Cthulhu, tentacles and fungus and all kinds of stuff. So it's just classic that he is the one that did this illustration for the book. Just thought that was like perfect, casting, if you will. So then you've got your glossary of espionage-related terms. This is great. Again, very helpful to try to help you to immerse yourself in the genre. It's pretty long. There's a lot of some cool terms in here. Okay, keeps going and going. Okay. And then you've got your bibliography. So this is also fun because it's a mix of fiction and nonfiction. So, of course, you've got your Ian Fleming books, for, like James Bond and stuff like that. But you also have things like the Complete Martial Arts Catalog, or the Weapons Culture, The Spy Who Came In From the Cold is going to be, not fit, but like you've got Modern Small Arms, the Complete Book of Rifles and Shotguns. So you can see that they really leaned into this idea of like, we want to make this accurate to like what these weapons actually do, which is kind of cool. You've got a repeat here of your weapons chart in the back. Okay, so these are kind of like your frequently referenced tables. You've got your agent dossier in the book. Okay, 2 sides. And then you have your other fine TSR products that are available. So you've got module TS002, which I mentioned. That's the one that I have that I put in my box. Operation Rapid Strike. Okay, and then it's listing you can get your Dungeons & Dragons basic set. So this is a new edition of the D&D rules covering dungeon adventures and character levels 1 through 3. So since this is published in 1983, depending on when this is published, it could be the Menser set from Beckme, or it could be the Moldvay Cook. So it just really depends on when in 1983 this particular edition came out. But as you got Boot Hill, so that would be the second edition of the game in 1979. Gamma World, this is by this point probably the second edition of Gamma World. Awful Green Things from Outer Space, Divine Right, Dungeon, Fight in the Skies by Mike Carr, we talked about a minute ago, Fourth Dimension, Knights of Camelot, and Snit's Revenge. Okay, and then on the back here, you've got some more frequently referenced stuff. So that was it. And then I think the other thing in this box set was, yes, you've got your invitation here to join the Role Playing Game Players Association. So Role Playing Game Association membership, which I never filled out. I never joined all my years of playing. I never joined. I have some characters in here. Looks like on my old notebook paper and my old dot matrix printer paper. Anyway, so that is the game. Now, next up, we're going to talk about the first expansion to this game. I'm just going to go through it very, very briefly, which is the Top Secret Companion. And then I'm going to briefly talk about 3 other spy games that came out after this. So this is 1980, the first spy game. And then 3 more games came out in 1983. Actually, they were all 3 published at the same time. One of them ends up eclipsing Top Secret in popularity as far as being the most popular role-playing game for a while. And we'll talk about that in a second. Now, one of the things that's interesting about the original Top Secret, that's kind of a funny story, is that during playtesting of the game, they were writing notes back and forth for missions. And one of these notes was written on TSR letterhead. So the story that I've heard, I've read this several different times by different people. So, and there was an FBI investigation. There seems to be documentation for that I've seen online, although that seems to have come later. So I'm not sure it's possible that this might have been one of those stories that's just been repeated so often that everyone believes it. But what I have seen is that this notification that was written on this TSR letterhead was talking about the assassination of this guy. I think his last name is Weatherby. That was going to take place in, he was like an important American businessman, and it was going to take place in Beirut in Lebanon. And somehow this document found its way into the hands of the FBI, who came to TSR to do an investigation to figure out what this was all about. My understanding is that they very quickly figured out that this was not a real thing. These were just gamers, and it was all a misunderstanding. But it was a big enough deal that TSR used it in the some of the marketing for Top Secret to kind of talk about, it's the game that's so good that we fooled the FBI kind of thing, which again was not what they were trying to do. It was if it happened, it was a mistake. But that's a fun little piece of history. But in any event, there's a supplement for the game that comes out. So there's several different modules. And what's interesting is that Top Secret is the first role-playing game published by TSR that is immediately supported with supplemental materials upon publication. So you can see this here is TSR 007, but there were 1 through 6. So TS001, that was the module that was included inside the box set of the original box. But then TS002 is Rapid Strike, and then 2 through 6, those are adventure modules that are published along the way. There was also a administrator screen kind of thing. But so unlike games like, say, Metamorphosis Alpha, which never got any supplemental material, or Boot Hill that didn't get anything published until the second edition was published in 1979, Top Secret right out the gate is supported. But and it becomes very quickly a very popular role-playing game just for its unique genre, and it sort of owns that espionage, universe of gamers for a little bit until, and we're going to talk about this in the next part of the video, but until 1983 when a few other games get published. But they come back in 1980, it's either 84, 85, we'll see in a second, with this publication. This is Top Secret Companion. So basically what this is, it's a collection of new rules and expanding the rules to the game. And there are a few things in here that are repeats of articles that had been written in Dragon Magazine, but the majority of it is new. And so you can see here some of the stuff that's in here, and I'm just going to go through this super, super quickly. But designed by Merle Rasmussen, edited by Steve Winter. So I had the privilege of working with Steve Winter on, I think it was the very first time that I judged the one-page dungeon contest. I think that was 2013, maybe 2012, 2013, something like that. And I got a chance to work with Steve, and I was super excited because I remember reading his name in Dragon Magazine over the years. I knew who he was. So, okay, published 1984. So just talked about that. And so basically what we're going to see here is we're going to see some new personal traits. So these are more of those derived stats that are coming out of like your original stats. So this has a trait of observation, which is taking your willpower and your knowledge and dividing it by 2. And that's going to be your observation trait. And then your shock resistance is courage plus willpower divided by 2. And then your perception is your courage plus your observation divided by 2. So these are all skills that are derived based on what your ability scores originally are. There's this alignment chart here. They talk about alignment later, but essentially it's telling you that your character should look at 3 different axes, 3 different axes based on their sort of political leanings and how they feel about the free market or just selling in general and things like that. It's going to get into more details later, but that's why this chart looks so goofy, because there's 3 of them and they decided to place it like this in this format, which is, I don't know, not how I would have done. All right, so then it gets into other traits. Now, this is interesting. If you remember in the original rules, it said that when you picked your character, or you were designing your character, you got to pick, like, your handedness was determined based on the handedness of the player. And then you pick like your nationality, your sex, all that kind of stuff. This is going to make you roll for everything. So it's going to make you roll to determine if your character is male or female or the player's choice, and which is only a 2% chance. But if it's the player's choice, then you have a better chance of disguising as the other sex. So that's in here. It's going to let you pick your face, hair color, eye color, and complexion. But it is going to make you roll to determine your handedness. So instead of being based on the player, you're going to roll, which means there's a 1% chance you might be ambidextrous. It's going to make you roll for your weight. It's going to make you roll for your blood type. So it's all about rolling now. It's changing a lot of that. Okay, so it talks about fingerprints and voice prints, things like that. Your physique, tall or short. Talks about your personal life and your birthplace and your residence, and your education, which you're going to roll for, and then your military record, which is a percent chance based on your age. So there's all that in here. So this is just like fleshing out your character. Okay, then it's going to talk about your military record. And now here it's going to get into your political and economic alignment. So economic was the word I was looking for, like with free market on one end and communism on the other. So that's how you view economics. But then you're also going to have your viewpoint on political change. How quickly do you want things to change? And then it's going to have things based on what political system do you prefer, democracy at one end and autocracy at the other end. So that's your alignment in this particular game. And you can roll for it, kind of figure it out if you really need to. And then it has cover occupation. So this is something not talked about at length in the original book, but the idea that your spy, if everyone knew you were a spy, you wouldn't last very long. So you have to have a cover occupation, and how much you make from that occupation, all that kind of stuff. That's all listed in here. So you see all these different ones listed. It talks about taxes and tax evasion and Swiss bank accounts, like very, very detailed wills. All right, now it's going to add some new areas of knowledge. It adds, I think, 5 new ones in here. It redefines one or kind of revises one. And then the other thing that's very key in this book is it's going to define what the areas of influence or areas of knowledge can do, because they weren't defined in the other book. If you saw that, they were listed, but it didn't actually give you a description of how to use it, what's it used for. Okay, so that's going to be a big part of this book. Should also point out that this is the supplement to the original game, but it is longer. This is a 96-page book, whereas the original book was only 64 pages. So this is all going through all of that. Then it's adding new bureaus. So it's going to add, I think, 2 new bureaus in this one. And then it's also adding some new divisions, which in D&D terms would be called a subclass. So you've got your section 1, the administration bureau, which it's actually now giving you level titles for the administrator. And then there's a subclass or division called special agents. So you see that here. And then you've got a new subclass of investigation called infiltration. You have a new subclass of confiscation for logistics. And you have a new division in total called technical, the technical bureau. And then there's a specialty division within the technical bureau. And then you have a new bureau, operations, and then a subdivision or a subclass or division, analysis. And then in your assassination bureau, you have a new division called protection. So those are all defined here. So what's interesting is that basically it says special agents work directly under an administrator without an official operator. So they act as troubleshooters, blunt instruments, and internal investigators, among other things. They often work solo or in small, tightly knit groups. And then it talks about with administrators, it says it's not officially an agent's role unless the administrator has a character in the field or positioned where action can take place. So this is basically for a, now what you'd call like a DM run character. That's what this is, the way that it's being defined here. It's very interesting. So details on those, and then it gets into this idea of what it's essentially multi-classing. It's talking about how you can operate in different classes, because one of the things that you could do in the original game, and it talks about this, you start out in confiscation, but you decide later you want to go into investigation, and you can't do that. You just start over. And so one of the things it says here is like, if you do that, you're sort of combining things. So it gives you all these special classifications. So I'm over here on the left, and it talks about magician is a mix of investigation and confiscation, and hunters are investigation, assassination, etc. Okay. And then it's going to go on and define what all those do and what they mean. Then you have your agent role, contacts, freelance work, enemy agents, double agents, triple agents, deep penetration agents, blunt instruments, and expendable agents. So it talks all about that. Oh, and moles. I missed that one. All right. So then now the layout in this is very, very interesting because you see here we've got some blank space. And then we get into this section on missions. So these are additional jobs that you can do that weren't included in the original rule book. And again, I don't want to go too much into this, but then it gets into random mission generation, and it talks about how like you can figure out where a mission is going to take place by rolling dice, figure out what continent it takes place on, and then what region within that continent does it take place on. And then, are you on an offshore vessel? And if so, is it a research vessel, or a speedboat, or a fishing boat? All this can be determined by dice. Okay, and then it talks about mission execution. So a lot of this now is written for the administrator. This is the administrator section to tell them how to set up adventures and what they call missions in this particular game. So diplomatic immunity and debriefing, all this kind of stuff. Gambling devices, picking pockets, counterfeiting, travel, and then air travel and water travel, trains and buses, all that kind of thing. The long section on travel, and then it gets into some more some stuff with weapons, equipment, and then combat. So they changed the rules on combat. It says they've been expanded considerably, expanded to the point where they're actually different, I guess, if you want to look at it this way. So, and it talks a little bit about that. So ammunition modifiers and doing half damage and things like that. So there's all your pages for their stopping power of different kinds of ammunition, and different things that might happen with shock and paralysis, broken ribs, etc. Involuntary hit response, accelerated hand-to-hand combat. So that's when two characters are within 10 feet of each other at the start of the combat turn, and neither wishes to fight for possession of an item. So that was a big thing in the original rules that talked about hand-to-hand combat and breaking it down into like different sections. And one of them was like, are you trying to grab and hold on to an item and keep it away from someone else? So that's all kind of detailed in here, and like kind of a new version of hand-to-hand combat. So you can see this is a lot of this is more for the administrator than it is, but upfront part is for everybody. More more equipment, like I talked about, lots of surveillance stuff in here. So this really expanded the game, and now one of the reasons that they're doing this is because they are trying to keep interest in the game, because again, in 1983, three new games came out. One in particular, which is going to be the James Bond 007 role-playing game. That one really kind of captured people's imaginations, and it quickly became people's preference for espionage style games. um, for some people, I mean, some people might want to stick with Top Secret. There were other games that came out, so clearly there was enough of an interest that people were creating new games. However, Top Secret's going to be one of the few that lasts. It is going to get a revised edition in 1987. I'm not going to talk about that one at all, but it's called Top Secret SI, which I think stood for Special Investigations. Brand new designer, I believe that was Dave Cook, and the mechanics are completely different. So it's again trying to build on the legacy of Top Secret, whereas the 007 game is going to they lose the license, and so it stops being published after I think only 4 years of time. So this companion for Top Secret again is a way to kind of keep interest and keep people from leaving for other systems. So more in here. Then you've got your Espionage College Course Handbook. So this is really fun. This is more for players, but it gets into different things that you can learn how to do that your character can learn how to do. Okay, and then it has your administration file here, a different section, and then there's an adventure in here, Operation Meltdown. So the rest of this is mostly going to be for that adventure that's in here. So you have all your tips in running it, and you've got your maps, and here's your different diagrams and maps and stuff, and it's got your character list. So listed here, 8 characters at each of the 3 agency bureaus. So and it talks about using them in the game, in this adventure. So here's some fun diagrams for different aircraft, which I thought was kind of cool. And that's going to be it. So that's it for our look at Top Secret. For the next 3 games, I'm not even going to really get into going through the mechanics. I'm just going to kind of show them to you very, very briefly, so that you can understand that there were people that were looking to expand this genre of espionage games. Okay, so as I mentioned before, Top Secret was kind of the only espionage role-playing game available until 1983, when 3 separate espionage role-playing games were published. Of the 3, the one that probably had the most lasting impression is this one, James Bond 007, Role-Playing in Her Majesty's Secret Service, the complete basic game including an introductory adventure. This is by Victory Games, so let's just briefly talk about that. The short version is there was a wargaming company called Avalon Hill. Predates Tactical Studies rules. It's been around since I want to say 1958, I think is what I remember. And so very popular wargaming company. And then they ended up competing with another company called Simulations Publications Inc., or SPI, which was started specifically to save a magazine called Strategies and Tactics from folding, from going out of publication. And so SPI, I called it SPY in one of my videos because that's what my friends called it back in the day. But a lot of people corrected me and said, I've never heard anyone say that. We always said SPI. So that's great. I'm going to say SPI, but my friends and I said SPY. But in any event, they saved Strategies and Tactics magazine, and then they started publishing games. Now, we talked about this before in another video, but that's the short history of those 2 companies. They're going to be important because what happens is SPI ends up falling on some bad times, okay, and they're having difficulties with just staying afloat, and TSR swoops in and is able to acquire SPI and all of its licensees and inventories. Now that turns out to be not a great thing. There was a bunch of stuff that kind of happened, including TSR then also acquiring all of the debts that SPI had, which were quite substantial at the time. But what happened was TSR was very slow in handing out employment offers to SPI's staff. And
quite a few of them were naturally pretty nervous about their future, and 8 of them end up leaving. They quit, and then Avalon Hill is waiting in the wings, kind of, and they end up taking those 8 people and having them help start a subsidiary of Avalon Hill called Victory Games, to be created specifically for the reason to publish role-playing games, which, Avalon Hill is a war game company, but everyone was seeing at this point that the future of hobbyist gaming was swinging very heavily over to the role-playing game genre, and so they needed to do that. So this happens kind of like early 1982, or like spring-ish of 1982. And what one of the people that ends up working with this new company, Victory Games, is a man by the name of Jerry Klug, or I think Gerald Christopher Klug, but they called him Jerry. And he had been working on an espionage game already, anyway, back when he was still at SPI. And they were going to call it License to Kill. But when they get over to Victory Games from Avalon Hill, Avalon Hill is actually able to acquire the James Bond license from both the book publishers as well as the people who own the movie rights. So they got the rights from both companies to produce this game. And so the game was changed to the name of James Bond, which is just going to have greater appeal because they were the only company now that had this name to produce this role-playing game. So pretty quickly upon publication, it begins to eclipse Top Secret, and does eclipse Top Secret in terms of sales. So in its first year of publication, it sells about 100,000 copies, which is pretty big in the role-playing game universe, especially back in those days in the early 80s. So this is, the cover. You see, some of the people here that worked on it, but there's our Gerald Christopher Klug as being the lead designer. And so a few of the things that this game has that kind of made it, more popular, let's say, than Top Secret, and that some of the other espionage games that were published. Now, one of the things is it has the name rights. So when this is published the same year as the other 2 games, unfortunately, those games just didn't have a chance. If these people didn't have the name, if Victory Games didn't have the name of James Bond, it might have been a little bit more competitive. But because they had the name, it's really, that gave them just a huge a boost in terms of sales. But as far as mechanics, some of the things that the game does, it's all point buy. So unlike a class and level system like Top Secret, this is a point by character generation system, and it has optional flaws that you can add to your character, which was a relatively new concept at the time. It had kind of, hero games had it for champions and things like that, but for the most part, that wasn't a thing that you thought of with your game, as like having your character be flawed. And so adding this kind of helped it stand out from some of the other games. And then it also was one of the very, very first systems that had a unified task system for everything. So everything's rolled on percentile dice. This game also uses D6s for other things, but for the most part, it's going to use percentile dice. And every single task that you do in the game, no matter what it is, you're going to roll percentile dice to determine your success. You're going to compare that to a quality results table, the QRT, and it's going to tell you how well you succeeded. So that was another thing that this had that other games didn't have. It's not a binary success fail. It's your quality of success. How well did you succeed? And then that determines the result. And so it does end up being a much, I would say, heavier of a role-playing game than it does combat, partly because of that quality of the result that you're going to get, which is interesting, I think. So it's quick. It's and it really helps to emulate that really kind of action-packed cinematic nature of the James Bond franchise. So, and again, the game is created for that purpose. So it's not, a lot of people say Top Secret is kind of Dungeons and Dragons derivative. I think that's not a kind or very generous way of looking at it. I think that's a little too oversimplistic, but it does still have a little bit of baggage is not the right word, but a little bit of its design concepts, going back to that idea of like levels and classes or bureaus of investigate or whatever, whereas the James Bond game is kind of designed from the ground up. So it is a skill-based system, and it is one of one of the first completely skill-based systems, not the first, but one of the first, because skill-based games, it was a new thing, moving beyond that class system that you'd seen from Dungeons and Dragons. So, um, here's your quality results table that I was just talking about. So, excellent, very good, good, or acceptable. Okay, so in the game, characters are considered to be better than most NPCs. So that's another thing that's different about this game, unlike other role playing games where you start out as kind of like a nobody and then you have to work your way up to become, more powerful, for lack of a better term. In this particular game, the characters start out already being better than the average person. And you can tell that from the quality results table, because the lowest result you can get is still acceptable. So it's different. It's not like there's a poor or a fail on this. I mean, you can, if you can fail by not hitting your number, but it's, we're not going to get too deep into the weeds on the mechanics here. Um, so it goes through, you have your characters here. So here you have James Bond, and he's statted up. There are ability scores here, 5 ability scores: strength, dexterity, willpower, perception, and intelligence, or it might be intellect. It's fine, doesn't matter. So that's your 5 ability scores that you start out with. So I don't think there's any surprises there. And it's intelligence. There it is. Sorry for flipping back and forth there, folks. And then you get into your skills. And so it talks about skills and how to generate them and figuring that out. So skills, very James Bond like. So if you look at this character sheet, look like one of the skills, seduction, right? So very, very relevant to that genre and those stories. Okay. But all the skills are based on your attributes, and then kind of determining what that score should be. So really, that's going to be it. So one of the things that's interesting in this is it divides things up into players and game masters, dungeon masters, or not dungeon masters, obviously, but so that your referee has information in here too, all in the same book. This is a long book. It's 116 pages. So you saw the original Top Secret with 64 pages. The Top Secret Companion is going to be 96 pages. This is going to be 116. So just more and more stuff in here. There's things like different cities. There's fame points in here. They work differently than how fame points work in Top Secret, but the concept's kind of the same. Again, it's based on this idea that your character can become known. In this case, in this particular game, you don't necessarily want your character to be known, because that means you can't operate as effectively if everybody knows who you are. There's hero points that you can spend to improve a die roll by 1 quality rating. So again, these are things that we might kind of take for granted today in some modern games, but it's been, more than 40 years since this game came out. Experience and character growth. So, you get the idea here. There's some fun art in here. Game master section on how to be a game master, and your non-player characters, the organization. So it talks about working for MI6. You might work for the CIA if you choose to do that, but this is kind of designed for you to be working for MI6. Now, one of the things that's interesting in here is this group here on page 120. On the right-hand side, you see Tarot. So this is the replacement for Spectre. And the reason that Spectre's not in this game is because there was a dispute over the rights to that particular game. There was an writer that worked on Thunderball and some other stuff, and I can't remember his name right now. He's an Irish writer. And he was in a legal dispute over who owned this. And so they had to they removed that for legal reasons, remove Spectre, and it's the person that heads it up, and replaced it with Tarot and this guy Carl's Ferenc Scorpios. So those are replacements. The other thing it tells you in this book that's really interesting is when you are acting out, or when you're going through these adventures, because a lot of the published adventures are based on James Bond stories. So the different movies or the different books that were written by Ian Fleming, and so like The Island of Dr. Notes. This is a perfect example. However, they tell you in here as a player, don't do what James Bond does in the movies because we've changed stuff. So one of the things they're able to do is use a lot of the setting information and a lot of the ideas, but then they make significant changes so that if you try to follow it like the stories that you're familiar with, you will fail. And I thought that was a really interesting way to approach it, to keep the stories that people want to see. You want to play on the island of Dr. Moreau. You want those stories, but if you know how it works, then there's no excitement, or anything like that, and there's no suspense to it. But they made changes on that to help you be able to play this. So anyway, that's the quick look at this game. It becomes, again, the most popular spy game. Now, unfortunately, what happens? Well, a few things. Avalon Hill publishes everything for this game in box sets because that was their kind of forte. So they already had the systems in place. They had the printing, they had the distribution, so they were able to publish even like adventures are published in box sets. And because they're doing that, they're able to do things like include fun handouts. We'd seen that started to happen already in like Call of Cthulhu, but they're capitalizing on being able to do that in this game. The downside of doing that is that, unlike you saw in the box set for Top Secret, where it had that thick cardstock cover, for the James Bond game, when Avalon publishes it, they don't use the thick cover. And so the actual books, they don't hold up as well during play at the table, and there were a lot of complaints about that. The other thing that's going to happen is, after only 4 years of having this license, the renewal comes up, and Victory Games is not able to renew the license to James Bond, and so the game ceases publication. So in that particular case, both Victory Games and the rights holders, I think it was the movie rights holders in particular, they blamed each other, but it didn't matter. It wasn't going to happen. So the game ceases publication, and coincidentally, in 1980, I'm pretty sure it's 1987, which is the year that James Bond stops being published. That's when you get Top Secret SI. So the special intelligence version of the Top Secret game, to kind of come back and recapture the audience that they had lost during the James Bond years, only a 4-year time span. So sadly, Victory Games in general just doesn't last that long. And then Avalon Hill ends up being acquired by our friends at Wizards of the Coast. So Wizards of the Coast now owns the Avalon Hill catalog. However, they haven't done anything. And at this point, I would suspect they're not going to do anything, because they would have done it by now, with the role-playing game licenses that were held by Victory Games via Avalon Hill. Now, the James Bond one is, a tough one, because it does involve getting another party to get the rights to it. I'm not sure if they would be able to make a case that they could strip the mechanics away and like create an open game license version of this game just based on the mechanics. Or didn't even have to have an open game license. They could just publish it whatever they want. Clearly, they're not going to do that. I mean, again, if Wizards was going to publish this, they would have done it already. So I think for better or for worse, the role-playing games owned by Avalon Hill, those are gone forever at this point, unless you can, find used copies. So that's a quick look at the James Bond 007 game and its publisher, Victory Games. Okay, so the other two games I'm going to talk about last here, I'm going to go, again, very, very briefly, but there are two of them: Mercenaries, Spies, and Private Eyes. And then the other one is called Espionage, the secret agent role-playing game. Later, this is going to change its name to Danger International. Okay, but originally came out as the game Espionage. So both of these come out in 1983, and there's actually a really funny story here. I'm going to read part of it. This is from the book Heroic Worlds by Lawrence Schick. We've talked about Lawrence Schick before. So he publishes this game, I think it was in the 90s, I forget. Not game, it's a book about basically the history of role-playing games as of that time, and it's just covering all the different games. So basically what happens is there's an interview in here. So you see that Mercenaries, Spies, and Private Eyes is written by Michael Stackpole, a very famous science fiction fantasy author. Wrote a lot of Star Wars books. And then Espionage is by George MacDonald and Steve Peterson. Okay, so this one's published by Mercenaries, Spies, and Private Eyes is published by Flying Buffalo, and and Espionage is published by Hero Games. All right, so Michael Stackpole, this is an interview with him, and he says, I'm not going to read all this because it's a little long, but he talks about creating games that fill leisure time as a unique occupation, so blah blah. So then he says that on the first unnerving experience that he had came before Mercenary Spies and Private Eyes ever saw print. So he's worked on the game, hasn't even come out yet. And he says everybody knew that Flying Buffalo was working on it, but he heard that the folks over at Hero Games were pushing to get their Espionage, out before we could bring MSPE onto the market. Over the 4th of July week in 1982, Steve Peterson and George McDonald of Hero Games arrived in Phoenix to attend a convention. But I wanted nothing to do with them. Basically, he doesn't want to talk to them because they're, in his mind, they're his competitors. And so during the convention, he's at a party and he starts talking to the guy seated next to him. And because they were side by side, he didn't read the guy's name tag. He just starts talking. And he said he seemed like a really nice guy. They start talking about games. And then he starts, Michael Stackpole, basically the way he says is kind of starts bragging about the mechanics that he's putting into his game. And so he said, I talked about stuff that I thought would push role playing forward. And then this other guy nods and he says, that's it exactly, you understand. He told me, that's exactly what we're doing in Espionage. And he says, and my head snapped up, and then he introduced himself as George McDonald. So, one of the co-authors of this game. So, and then he says then he got introduced to Steve Peterson, and they all became friends. And they agreed to link their scenarios. So that's what's interesting, I think, because now, you only had one Espionage role-playing game, and then in 1 year you've got 3 coming out, and one of them has the James Bond title. So I think what these guys figured out was, well, one of them, as they were talking, it seemed like they were using some similar design mechanics, and so they decided to end up cross-promoting and linking their first few scenarios that get published. So then he talks about the art on here, and he says they got it by accident. So they actually were trying to hire another person to do the art, and that person basically said no, he wouldn't do the job, but he said his son will do it. And I guess his son started working on it, and they didn't really know what was going to happen until they got this piece of art. So it's just kind of interesting how small this community is, that these two guys ended up sitting next to each other at a convention without knowing each other, and then kind of ended up linking their games to try to help with sales. So this game doesn't last, too awfully long. Flying Buffalo publishes it first, and I think it ended up being published by somebody else. So yeah, you can see this here, Blade, a division of Flying Buffalo. But anyway, so that's Mercenary, Spies, and Private Eyes. And then for Espionage, again, I told you they end up renaming it to Danger International. But, neither game really has, unfortunately, too much of a lasting impact on the role-playing game community. Mercenary, Spies, and Private Eyes probably more so. The mechanics in this one are actually based on Tunnels and Trolls as a start, and then kind of adapts them to the genre. But it had that going for it. This one's based on the Hero system, which a hero game still like Champions, which is a superhero game. So they both had a sort of, I guess, a built-in audience if you were already playing like Tunnels and Trolls and you wanted a spy type game and you didn't want to go to Top Secret or James Bond. But anyway, that's kind of what happened with these games. They're all just kind of published, but everyone just got hammered by the James Bond game. It just did so well. Nothing against these two particular games at all. They're just they unfortunately just didn't have the name recognition to go with them. So that's it for our look at the first Espionage role-playing game, Top Secret. We did a very deep dive on that. And then, of course, going over some of the competitors that came out. Now, again, there is another version of Top Secret, Top Secret SI, that I did not talk about here. So I have much less familiarity with that one because I never played it. I did play the first Top Secret quite a bit. You saw my character sheet in there. I did an illustration of one of my characters once. I remember in art class, essentially trying to impress a girl after I moved, and I was kind of shy. So I thought, oh, she sees me drawing, maybe she'll talk to me. But whatever, that's neither here nor there. So um, we had a lot of fun playing Top Secret. Played it less than Gamma World. Played it less than Marvel Superheroes, but we did played it way less than we played Dungeons and Dragons. But it was a game that was on our radar back in the day, and so that's going to be it for this particular video. So I hope you enjoyed it. I know I've been making some long videos lately, but I've been covering games that I haven't talked about, and I feel like it's important to kind of talk about how they evolved and who created them and how they differ from Dungeons and Dragons. So coming up, I'm going to be doing another one of my DM advice videos. So again, for you people that just like the history videos, if you could try to help me out and just give those a like and maybe share them with a DM friend or something of you, even if you're just here for the history, I would really appreciate your support in those, because they always perform less than my history videos. Although I do have a small but very vocal community here that the main reason they come here is for those DM advice videos. So I do want to keep making them because I enjoy making them. I have fun with them, and I think that they are, it's kind of one of the reasons why I started the channel, was to do those. So that's coming out. We'll be doing issue 2 of Dragon Magazine. So if an in-depth review of that particular one. It's been a while since I've done Dragon Magazine. And then, we'll see what the next history video is after Dragon Magazine. We'll figure that out. So with that said, I'd like to thank you so very much for watching through this. Please give the video a like. And if you could subscribe to the channel if you haven't already done so, again, I appreciate your subscription and comments. So you guys leave tons of great comments. Again, I very much apologize for being so far behind. I do try to keep up on them. So please, continue to leave comments. Let me know what you thought about these games. Did you prefer one over the other? Did you prefer James Bond over Top Secret? Or I'd really love to hear from folks who were who liked Espionage or / Danger International and Mercenaries, Spies, and Private Eyes. Those are the folks I'm really interested to hear from, because you just don't hear as much about those games. I don't even remember Espionage really from back in the day. I definitely remember Mercenaries, Spies, and Private Eyes from ads in Dragon Magazine. But I'd love to hear from folks who played those. So leave a comment below and let me know what you thought about that. Also, if you want, go ahead and let me know what you want to see me cover next. So I had a lot of people ask me to cover Top Secret, which is why I did this. Also, while you're down there below, you'll see where you can join me on social media. So all of my links are there, all the different platforms. And also links to my blog, where I'm sharing content mostly for Dungeons and Dragons, and links to support me by buying something at my shop. So again, anything that you buy at my shop is a huge help of support for the channel, to help me eventually upgrade some of my equipment here. So, t-shirts, hoodies, mugs, posters, notebooks, anything like that you get at my shop helps put some money back into the channel. And also, one of the things that will help do is I am looking at going to a big convention pretty soon. I'll announce it when I know for 100% whether I'm going. But it's not GaryCon, unfortunately, as I mentioned that. But if I go, I will let you guys know ahead of time. And for folks who are there, I'd love to meet up. But supporting the channel will help pay for hotel and flights. So again, that's going to be it. So I would like to thank you so very much for watching. Stay safe, happy gaming, and I will talk to you next time.
And now for the bonus content, what I was drinking, what I was listening to when I made my notes for this album. Or for this video, I should say. So I made a sour style drink. This particular one is a whiskey sour with bourbon. And just wanted you to see the egg foam there on the top. So I put egg whites in most of my sours. I know a lot of people don't like to do that. So if you don't like it, leave it out. It does add, of course, a very silky texture to the drink. And I quite like it. So it's just bourbon and sugar and lemon. So for the sugar portion, I used a toasted cinnamon simple syrup, which I made by toasting a few cinnamon sticks in a pan. And then I had those ready to go. And then I made a standard simple syrup. And then I added my toasted cinnamon sticks in there and let that steep to kind of absorb the flavor. So specifically wanted cinnamon for a reason I'm going to explain in a second. And then again, I put the egg white in. And then my bartender taught me a technique. It's called a dry shake. So it means you put all your ingredients in the shaker and you shake them without ice. And so that's why it's called dry shake. There's no ice. And that's going to help that egg white to foam up. And then you can add your ice and shake again. You just have to really shake it because you need to make sure that the egg white stays frothy. My bartender, again, she actually does an extra step when she does this. So it's dry, wet, dry. So she then strains out the ice after she's chilled the drink down, and she refrosts the egg by dry shaking again. So it's a technique she learned when she was in Japan. And that's what I did here. Okay. So the other thing I did in this one, you can kind of see these little colored dots on the top. I used some Holiday Pie Bitters by El Guapo, because by the time this video drops, it's going to be Monday, March 4th, which a lot of people call Pie Day. So I thought it would be fun to use a pie bitters. So I'm drinking this over the weekend, but I'm getting ready for Pie Day. And the reason I wanted cinnamon in my drink was because cinnamon always reminds me of Spice from Dune. And so I wanted to go see the new Dune this weekend with my family. We saw the first one together with my daughter's best friend, who also plays in our D&D game, and her family. But both my daughter and her friend were sick, so we couldn't go. But hopefully we'll see it soon. But I pulled out my original soundtrack to the 1984 David Lynch version of the movie. Now, I know a lot of people hate this movie. I like it. I saw it in the theater with my friends. Coincidentally, we were supposed to be playing D&D. My mom had dropped me off at their house to play D&D, and we instead left. I borrowed one of my friend's bikes, and we biked over to the strip mall that had a small movie theater, and we saw Dune. So I just have fond memories of that from my childhood, and I actually really dig the soundtrack. So what's kind of interesting about this, if you see here, it says it's written, composed, and performed by Toto. The prophecy theme is by Brian Eno. So there's a lot of really interesting things with this particular album, but most of the tracks, it says it credits it to Toto. They're actually mostly written by a guy named David Paich, Paich. I think it's pronounced Paich. But his father, Marty, was a very famous jazz composer, conductor, and arranger. Worked with a lot of very famous jazz people. And but I guess that they just thought that his name, David Paich's name alone, wasn't going to be enough to sell the soundtrack. And the members of Toto play on these. It's just that most of the songs are composed by David Paich. So they credited the album to Toto. This is about 2 years after the song Africa came out and made them like huge stars. However, the interesting thing, when they had never worked on a soundtrack before, they were offered to work on Footloose, to write like a kind of, a pop song, rock song for Footloose. And they turned it down to work on this because at the time Ridley Scott was attached, and they had kind of thought that like this was their chance to, kind of make something. This was supposed to be the new Star Wars. It obviously wasn't. It didn't sell great. So unfortunately, I guess they kind of felt like, a little bitter for a while. The other thing that happened that made him slightly bitter was that David Lynch was not getting a sound out of that he wanted out of them for a specific song. So he brought in Brian Eno, again, who did the prophecy theme. So there wasn't animosity. They all say they all got along great or like whatever. But you can kind of tell, like, for a while, the David Paich and Toto were sort of like, why are you bringing in someone else to do this other song? So funny little anecdote as well. The rock musician, some might call him punk or new wave or whatever you want to call him, Billy Idol, anyway, told Toto that this album is his favorite album of theirs. So give it a chance if you haven't checked it out. You can actually find it on Spotify. It's good background music, and it'll kind of get you in the mood for sort of like some fun, space science fiction type of adventures. So anyway, cheers to the movie Dune coming out. If you guys saw it, give me a comment and let me know what you think. I'm looking forward to part 2. And cheers to Pie Day.